On this Wednesday night, Ukrainians running out of time and places to bury their dead. Ukraine's president makes another plea for the West to do more.
Show more leadership.
The new sanctions against Putin's family and who still has no problem doing business with Russia. Approved a new oil project off Newfoundland and Labrador gets the green light from the federal government. Handling the sixth wave, where are the rising cases of COVID leading in Canada? Plus, answer, a 23-year-old Canadian.
It was pretty tough.
Question, who is Jeopardy's new champion?
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. As evidence of atrocities in Ukraine mount, the West is reacting with more sanctions, including against the children of Russian President Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister, and 2 more Russian banks. But Ukraine's president says it's not enough. Volodymyr Zelensky called out what he calls the doubts and indecisions in Europe to completely bar Russian energy imports, saying some leaders are more concerned about business losses than with war crimes.
After everything that we have gone through in Ukraine, after everything that Russian troops have done, we still have to convince Russian foreign politicians that we need to cut any ties of global banks, of Russian banks with the global financial system. We still have to convince Europe that Russian oil cannot feed Russian military machinery with new sources of funding.
Ukraine is bracing for the next phase of Russia's war. The Deputy Prime Minister has urged people in the eastern part of the country to get out while they still can, because Ukraine won't be able to help as Russia's invading forces move in. Crystal Goomansingh begins our coverage tonight, and a warning, some of the images in her story are disturbing.
Charred instruments of war line the streets of Bucha, while shell-shocked residents head out in search of basic supplies. For many, it is the first time they've risked being outdoors. I didn't get out of the house at all, not at all. I heard something like an explosion. My neighbor went to the crossroad and boom, that was it for him. Unimaginable scenes of destruction and death are everywhere and are overwhelming. This grieving man is urged to get up, told they have to start digging, that they're running out of time. Where possible, yards and gardens are used to bury loved ones. They came and brought this grief onto us, killed our friends, crippled our people, destroyed houses. Despite the images shared around the world and the independent confirmations from journalists and Red Cross personnel in Bucha, Russia continues to insist the bodies in the streets there are fake. Video of Russian aid being handed out in besieged Mariupol is the kind of imagery that fits the Kremlin's version of events. British intelligence says Russian forces are preventing more humanitarian aid from getting into Mariupol. Ukrainian officials say that port city has seen an estimated 5,000 civilians killed, some in Russian attacks, others starved to death. In the south and east of Ukraine, those who can are being told to get out now. Taking into account the events in Bucha and Hostomel, we should probably evacuate as many people as possible in order to save their lives.
We need to be prepared for a long haul.
NATO Secretary General says the atrocities in Bucha reveal the true nature of Vladimir Putin's war, while NATO ministers weigh options to support Ukraine. Many of the country's neighbors continue to do business with Russia. I have no problems paying for gas in rubles if Russia asks for this, says Hungary's newly elected Prime Minister Viktor Orban. It's a break from the European Union's position. But Orban, an ally of Putin who called Vladimir Zelensky an opponent, says he is willing to help facilitate a possible ceasefire. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
Now to the latest economic sanctions. If the point of them is to stop the Russian war, they clearly have not worked. And Europe continues to spend about $1 billion a day buying Russian oil and gas, pumping money into the Russian economy. The American president announced new sanctions today, a direct response, Joe Biden says, to the evidence of war crimes that's emerged from Bucha. Canada's response is to summon Russia's ambassador in Ottawa to make sure he's presented with images of the brutality. Jackson Proskow on the sanctions and the calls to do more.
From fresh sanctions on Russia's largest banks to a possible European ban on Russian coal, the West's latest moves aim to further punish Moscow for atrocities committed in Ukraine.
There's nothing less happening than major war crimes. Responsible nations have to come together to hold these perpetrators accountable.
For the first time, the U.S. is leveling direct sanctions on Vladimir Putin's adult daughters, believed to be hiding Putin's personal assets. The U.S. Department of Justice announced direct prosecutions of Russian oligarchs, capturing a $100 million yacht belonging to one of them.
The Justice Department will use every available tool to find you, disrupt your plots, and hold you accountable.
None of it has disrupted Russia's war in Ukraine. Sanctions remain reactionary. NATO leaders are wary of doing anything that might hurt their own economies.
These sanctions will not be our last sanctions.
Europe's top diplomat called out the contradiction, noting since the war began, Europe has given Ukraine 1 billion euros in aid, while still spending 35 billion euros on Russian oil and gas.
Putin is able to fund this war through the energy that has been sold to us and unfortunately has been doing this for many years now.
The EU has vowed to wean itself off those supplies. It may be forced to act sooner than expected. The West may also need to consider secondary measures against countries like China and India, who continue to trade with Russia. Moves with serious risks.
If the sanctions go this far and it pushes Putin into a more desperate situation, we have to ask, what's next? Is he going to retaliate on the battlefield? It is possible that Russia will resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, other sorts of very powerful weapons.
The emerging horrors may leave no other choice but to take further steps. For Ukraine, the price of inaction is already too high. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
Today, Pope Francis lamented the killing of civilians in Ukraine and kissed a Ukrainian flag brought from Bucha. He unfurled the flag at his Wednesday general audience at the Vatican. As he held the faded and stained flag, he said the killing of innocent civilians must cease. He invited a group of children who escaped the war to stand with him, urging the crowd not to forget them. And then he gave each child a giant chocolate Easter egg. The United Nations Children's Agency reports 2.9 million Ukrainian children are in need of help. They make up half the refugees fleeing the war. According to the UN Refugee Agency, more than 4.2 million people have now fled Ukraine, and 7.1 million people are displaced inside the country. Ontario is increasing its support for Ukrainians who come to that province. Today, Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced they'll receive access to provincial health coverage, emergency housing, and trauma counseling.
Good morning, everyone.
The province is also setting up a new hotline and email address to connect newcomers to local employers. Ford says Ontario is expecting about 40,000 Ukrainians to arrive in the province. Some late-breaking news from Ottawa. The federal government has approved the Bay du Nord oil project off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. Led by Norwegian company Equinor, the project consists of several oil discoveries about 500 kilometers northeast of St. John's. The company says when completed, the deepwater operation will be capable of producing up to 200,000 barrels a day and be worth about $3.5 billion to the Newfoundland and Labrador government. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson joins me now. Mercedes, this project passed all the environmental approvals, but the government delayed making a decision on it. How tricky a decision was it?
Well, it's symbolic, Donna, of how the government is trying to balance priorities here. This is a government that has been very aggressive on talking about climate change and talking about limiting oil and gas developing it. In fact, about capping it altogether. And here they are announcing a project. It's reflective of the difficult times they're finding themselves in, where they need big spending budgets, they believe, which are largely underpinned still by oil and gas spending. The revenues from those projects underlie all kinds of federal government spending. Also also with what's happening between Russia attacking Ukraine and the Russian oil sources being something that Western leaders don't want to touch. They'll be increasing pressure on Canada to allow access to our reserves. So it's really about the federal government trying to balance their priorities here, and we'll see whether they're able to do that successfully politically with the reaction to this project.
Now let's talk about the federal budget. Mercedes, it gets delivered tomorrow. The finance minister took part in a bit of political theater today, getting a new pair of shoes.
I think they fit perfectly. They look great.
The shoes, designed in Montreal, sometimes give clues about the tone of the budget, maybe about future policies. Mercedes, what are you hearing? What are you expecting?
High heels, high spending. We're expecting this to be another significant budget, as the last ones were. Those were driven by COVID. In this case, it'll be more about promises the government has already made. Here's a little clip of what the Prime Minister had to say about it earlier today.
In tomorrow's budget, you will see significant investments in housing, in supports for families, in a way that continues to grow our economy for families from coast to coast to coast for years to come.
Donna, some of those biggest items will be things like dental care, promises of pharmacare, but don't expect that to actually be allocated in tomorrow's budget. Affordability and the cost of living, something on a lot of Canadians' minds, is expected to be in the budget in terms of the government talking about it a lot, trying to calm people's fears about inflation. But realistically, there's not a lot the federal government can do about the supply side shocks that have caused that. And finally, we're expecting there to be significant defense spending in the billions of dollars to react to the evolving geopolitical situation and the reality that Canada needs to think more about defense. Donna?
Okay, we'll find out tomorrow. Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa, thank you. We will have live coverage of the federal budget tomorrow, starting at 4 o'clock Eastern on Global TV and online at globalnews.ca. The latest wave of COVID-19 cases coming up, the political response to the rising number of infections in Canada. Ontario is opening up eligibility for a fourth COVID-19 vaccine dose to those 60 and older, as cases and hospitalizations are slowly beginning to rise. As Eric Sorensen reports, provinces are taking a different approach in how to handle it.
Another COVID wave, the sixth if you're keeping count, is washing over the country. Ontario is the latest province to make a second booster shot, a fourth vaccine, available as early as tomorrow to anyone over the age of 60, along with vulnerable groups.
That's going to be really important for people to get that extra level of protection.
The move comes as hospitalizations have risen in Ontario from 611 2 weeks ago to 1,074, an increase of over 70%. And measurements of wastewater in Ontario suggests COVID levels are higher now than at any time in the past.
The wastewater virus is going up very vigorously indeed. It's a kind of an early warning system, and all across Ontario, especially eastern Ontario, those rates are increasing very, very rapidly indeed.
But that is not causing the province to consider new restrictions. Amid increasing social contacts, the province believes hospital capacity and ICUs can manage the surge in cases.
Knowing that we have the capability in our hospitals to manage this, this is something that we are sure that we're going to be able to get through. There's no cause for panic, that this was anticipated.
But as fourth doses become available across the country, it's not clear most Canadians will get it. Less than half the population has even received a third dose. And as society opens up, at the same time a highly transmissible variant is spreading, third shots are seen as the most urgent measure.
We've got to stop thinking of the third dose as being a booster. This is really a disease that's turned out to be a three-dose disease, a three-dose vaccine disease.
Province by province, there is growing divergence on public health measures. Quebec is worried enough that it's extended its mask mandate for public places until at least the end of April.
We have to wait and see how the progression of this wave will be.
While provincial governments are approaching public health measures on different timetables, they remain in lockstep on their best advice to keep the pandemic in check. Don't discard those masks, and do get caught up on your booster shots. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
There are some positive signs on the overall picture of COVID-19. New data from the World Health Organization shows COVID-19 deaths are falling worldwide. The confirmed number of deaths fell sharply last week by 43% to 26,000. The overall number of reported new cases also dropped by 16% last week to 9 million. But the WHO says COVID-19 infections are going undetected now as many countries reduce or eliminate testing and change how they track cases. Stretched thin ahead, can Canada keep up with tackling two major refugee crises?
You're watching Global National.
There's another conflict going on that's not getting as much attention as Ukraine. It's in Ethiopia's Tigray region, and two leading human rights groups say war crimes are being committed there. In a joint report, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch say hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans have been forced to flee their homes because of threats, intimidation, and a campaign of violence. And it claims there are widespread atrocities reported in western Tigray that amount to ethnic cleansing. The two organizations accuse security forces from the neighboring Amhara region. They're aligned with Ethiopia's government, which has been at war with Tigrayan rebels since November 2020. Canada has pledged to help refugees fleeing Ukraine, but that's on top of the commitment to settle refugees from Afghanistan, and that process is still far from over. Ottawa has committed to bring in 40,000 Afghan refugees. Since the Taliban takeover in August, it's only managed to resettle 10,000. As David Aiken reports, there are concerns government officials may not have the capacity to respond to both refugee crises.
When the Taliban took over Kabul, a Vancouver-based group, Canadian Women for Afghan Women, quickly tried to get its 25 Afghan employees and families out of the country. They'd been there promoting the rights of women and girls. But with last summer's election just underway, it became difficult to reach Canadian immigration officials.
Within days, it was clear that it wasn't business as usual. People were unavailable. Everything just kind of froze for a couple of months, actually. And that had real implications for people's lives.
In fact, documents obtained by Global News through several access to information requests show a government scrambling in the midst of an election and overwhelmed by the flood of requests for help. 90,000 emails had piled up by mid-August, and just 1 in 5 phone calls placed by desperate Afghans to Canadian officials was being answered. 5 of the 25 families employed by Canadian Women for Afghan Women did get out, but 20 families are still there, and it's why Lauren Oates was in Tajikistan on the Afghan border trying to help.
I've seen no progress at all on any of my colleagues' files, and it's getting exceedingly dangerous for them. I mean, our office has been visited by the Taliban. We've had many scary incidents, and the clock is ticking.
Some are now worried Canada does not have the capacity to handle a refugee crisis like the one in Ukraine and the still urgent crisis in Afghanistan. Canada's immigration minister says it does.
It's an enormous challenge. We're asking the system to do more than it's ever been required to do at a time when it's already facing pressures. But can we do it? I don't think we have a choice but to do it.
One of the themes in Thursday's budget, sources tell us, is what they're calling Canada in the world, and that's taken to mean more defense spending. But advocates tell us they hope Canada in the world also means more spending on refugees and foreign aid. Donna?
David Aiken in Ottawa, thank you. Next, the Canadian hotshot bringing hometown pride to TV's biggest quiz show. I mean, this probably needs a don't try this at home warning. That's Canadian Football League player Shai Ross showing off what he can do while carrying some serious weight. It's not the first time he's blown the internet's mind. Last year, Ross went viral with another backflip while casually dunking an Oreo cookie in a glass of milk. Another Canadian has earned some serious bragging rights. Nova Scotia's Matea Roach debuted as a contestant on Jeopardy on Tuesday night, and spoiler alert, the 23-year-old easily joined the ranks of the popular quiz show's champions. As Mike Drolet reports, this is how she did it and who is cheering the loudest.
A tutor from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Matea Roach.
For a show about trivia, Jeopardy sure missed the boat.
Yes, Matea Roach lives in Toronto, and the show has a policy: in Jeopardy's eyes, where you live is where you're from. But go away with ya. She's an East Coaster, which she managed to squeeze in.
Nova Scotia duck tolling is one breed of this sporting dog for whom fetch should be instinctual. Matea.
What is retriever?
That's correct, and you are from Nova Scotia. Exactly.
As soon as I saw the words Nova Scotia, I was like, I need to ring in and answer this clue.
Back home, there's nothing but Cape Breton pride, from the grocery store to the provincial legislature.
It's very, very difficult to get to the point where Matea has gotten to be one of the 3 people on an episode of Jeopardy!
Jeopardy just got some free advertising.
There's the other Daily Double.
Now, Roach's run has just begun on the iconic show, although it was taped in January.
Who is Putin?
Yes.
That was before Russia invaded Ukraine. The aspiring lawyer showed a wide range of knowledge.
What is speed skating? What is Game of Thrones? What is Archbishop of Canterbury?
Before closing out the game of her life with life.
What did you write down? You came up with what is life. That is correct.
Perhaps the hardest part came after the show. 2 months of keeping it to herself.
So it was pretty tough, I won't lie, because I was excited and, of course, wanted to share with people.
Her mom, Patty, says nobody seemed to mind.
Like, we don't know anybody who's ever been on Jeopardy before, so it's a little bit like an exclusive club, I think.
How it turns out is anybody's guess. Well, Matea knows, but when it comes to trivia, she doesn't need to guess. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. We leave you tonight with a tribute to Bjarni Tryggvason. He's one of Canada's original astronauts. Born in Iceland, he grew up in Vancouver. Originally a meteorologist, Tryggvason was selected to become one of Canada's 6 original astronauts back in 1983. He launched into space in 1997 as a payload specialist on the Space Shuttle Discovery. Tryggvason died on Monday at the age of 76. The Canadian Space Agency says he applied the highest standard to everything he undertook. And those close to him say Bjarni Tryggvason was a pioneer, a beloved friend, and the twinkle in Bjarni's eye always let you know that he saw the world in a different way. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves.